We're here interviewing Graham De Gruchy in his home in St Lucia. I'm John Macarthur.
It's a soft word, De Gruchy.
De Gruchy.
De Gruchy, okay.
Thank you, Graham.
Everybody puts a T in it.
It's the terrible
That's
Australian.
easy enough,
Yeah.
De Gruchy, okay. With
Janina Gosseye and Elizabeth Musgrave. It's on the 13th of December.
The 11th of December.
The 11th of December. So, Graham, I wonder if you could tell us how you first became interested in architecture, how you came to study it.
Well, as a young student, I was doing at high school art, and the art teacher introduced us to a very, very simple version of architecture, mainly history. But one day, looking at a magazine in a friend's house, I was about 16, I saw illustrations of Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water House. This was a Fortune magazine, probably 1936, 37 date, and it absolutely gobsmacked me. I was so interested in this house. I thought, I'm going to be an architect. So that was the beginning. In 1942, I think it was, I entered architecture school at the University of the Witwatersrand, and I interrupted that after a year and a half to become a fighter pilot. I joined the South African Air Force. I did the first pilot's course, which was theoretical. The air schools were jammed, but they wanted air gunners. So I said, okay, I'll become an air gunner. So that was a very quick course, which took me to Egypt at the end of the year. I did a final special course flying over Egypt, learning how to use guns up in a dorsal turret, looking down at the pyramids, etc. Wonderful. And then on to Italy. So I only had about 5 operations, but before going up to the squadron, they gave me 2 weeks leave. So I hitchhiked to Naples and up to Rome and had a wonderful few days in Rome. Went to the opera for the first time. You know, going to the opera in Rome is an experience. You've probably done it, but for me, at 20, it was just wonderful. Sorry, I turned 21 in Egypt, so at 21 it was good. I was recalled back to the squadron, which was then based up near Rimini, south of Venice. We did 5 operations and then the war ended. One night I was flying over Mestre doing a bombing run, and I knew Venice was on my right-hand side, flying the way we were flying, but I couldn't see a thing. It was blacked out. Anyway, within a few weeks, our squadron moved just north of Venice, and every weekend we could come back and go and be visitors to the city. Now, Venice was totally different. It had army ducks on the Grand Canal. It had hardly any ladies. The ladies were all kept inside because there were so many people in uniform. And so it was a very artificial but interesting place for me. Having done the history of architecture, up to a point, I was now able to see the reality of the piazzos in the ground and that wonderful square. St. Mark's Square is unique. It took 700 years to develop. I won't bore you with the history of St. Mark's, but this was absolutely beautiful. Anyway, I wasn't able to get back to South Africa because all the boats were full of people. They said, if you want to, you can go to a university in Florence, of all places, Firenze. I said, thank you. So for 3 months I went to Florence and had a wonderful time in a South African sponsored university. They took over an old, I think it was a palace at one time, and converted it with a library and facilities. I was taught to touch type and do all those sort of wonderful things at the same time. Because I was doing a course in psychology with the University of South Africa, that's how that worked. Anyway, in October, we were finally taken back to Egypt, and I was lucky enough to become the editor of the Al Maza Camel, which was a local newspaper run for the forces. And during that time I was also able to go down to have a look at Aswan and all the different temples at Luxor. I visited the Valley of the Kings, went down and had a look at one of the tombs, Seti II, I think it was. Absolutely fantastic. And then on to have a look at Hatshepsut's famous temple set against the cliff. What an incredible sight. You wouldn't believe it. Absolutely wonderful. Anyway, then back to South Africa and back to architecture. Because we'd been away and we were mature, they allowed us to go into the third year. I went into the third year, did exceptionally well in design, then into the final year after a year out, and completed my course in 1947. Yep. Worked for a few architectural firms, had my own practice, did all of the things that I've shown you.
Right.
1960, off to London. Spent a year in London with the London County Council, working on mainly a housing estate near the Crystal Palace, which I've got all recorded. During that time, I went with my family to Europe in a little VW, trekked 3,000 kilometres through Europe. Wonderful. They were very happy. Visited things like Le Corbusier's monastery, among many other wonderful things. Then I walked down the Strand and visited the New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australian houses. They all had shop fronts. Queensland had pineapples and palm trees, and they invited us to come to an evening one night, which was absolutely wonderful. They put slides up of Brisbane and the whole of Queensland, gave us pineapple juice. I was convinced this was going to be the place. So I wrote to the Public Works Department, which they suggested, and they offered me a good job. So the next thing, we were off in December on a lovely boat, first class, 5 weeks of heaven, landed in Sydney in January, came up by train. The train came up through South Brisbane, and I said to Joy, those are dunnies in the backyard. What are we doing? Where are we going? Anyway, we landed at South Brisbane railway station.
That was where the interstate line ended at that point.
That was the terminal.
Yeah.
And David Mercer, who was running the Department of Architecture, met us. He was a lovely person, very, very, very socially active, and he took us to Yungaba for the night, showed us around Brisbane by car, and the next day, I think that was a Sunday, the next day I went to work at the Works Department, which was in the old casino, the Treasury building. So I caught a ferry from Kangaroo Point across and a tram up to Treasury buildings, and they gave me a little spot in a corner to work in, introduced me to everyone, and I met all sorts of lovely people there. They had students among the qualified architects doing their architecture degrees, people like Errol Bullpitt. You may or may not know these names because this is 1962. Desmond White, I won't go into all the names. And the qualified people like Alf Camels, his son Peter, I think, did a course at the uni. He did that building that they want to pull down in George Street, the executive building. Yeah. Anyway, after doing a hospital for Tara, quite an interesting experience. I enjoyed doing that. Having somebody drive me up to Tara and have a look at Toowoomba, etc., and tell me all about Queensland. David Mercer put me on to looking at George Street and the potential for government offices. So I worked with John, I'll remember the name in a minute, who was a town planner working with the department, and we gave an idea of what could happen if you redeveloped George Street, what buildings could be pulled down, what could be put up, etc. And at that point, a position came up at the university in architecture, and since I was interested in being an academic rather than a public works person, I applied and got the job. So in 1963, October, I think it was, I moved over to the university, got to know the staff during the summer vac, and from then on I was a lecturer for the next couple of years.
Can I just take you back to one detail,
Okay,
Graham?
so
I was interested in you staying at Yungabar with your family when you first arrived.
for a day,
Just for a day?
yes.
I see, yeah.
Joy went out immediately and found a block of units. So we hired a flat between 3 stations. There was a filling station, the block of flats. I think there was a filling station, a police station, and the railway station. That's in Indooroopilly.
Right.
You know where the bridge is?
Yes, yeah.
I think that's all gone. They've redeveloped everything there.
Yeah, they have.
But that was quite a unique thing, but it was better than Yungabar.
Yungabar was where all the assisted immigrants stayed, so it must have been a very strange social mixture because there would have been
absolutely.
a lot of poor Yugoslav families and
But,
£10
you know,
poms.
we were,
£10 poms and
we were very independent people,
yeah.
and from that unit, we bought a car, station wagon, looked around Brisbane for somewhere to develop, and bought a house in Birdwood Terrace within about 2 weeks.
Right.
The old house had very high ceilings, I think 12 feet or something, about 4 meters. And I thought, that's crazy. The small spaces were very tall, so it would take the roof off. So I got a carpenter to take the roof off and put a skillion roof on, and that was my first house in Brisbane. And that was there for about 20 years, I think. It was pulled down about 4 years ago and
I
another
remember
house
it, yeah.
put up. Yeah. Okay.
Were you doing any other private practice while you were at Works?
Very little. A little bit. Joy was now starting a business. The Craftsman's Market, you may remember. Do you remember the Craftsman's
Yes, I
Market?
do. We were
Okay.
interested in design culture
Yeah.
in general, so perhaps you could
You're
tell us a little bit
just
about
old enough to remember, John, I think.
that.
Okay. It was an old house owned by the RSL in Jefferson Street.
Yes.
They had a hall and an old house, I think it might have been a shop, a butcher shop or something, with funny curved windows. So I designed a new front, and she hired the front 2 rooms and started Craftsman's Market. Well, gradually she took over the whole house, and not only the whole house, but she expanded into another house at the back, etc. And it became a very successful business. So
I remember she had the concession for Marimekko, is that right? Was
Yes,
interested in
Oh.
Scandinavian design.
with
That must have been very new to Brisbane at the time.
Well, it was totally new, and a lot of the furniture was imported. So this is almost an example, I think, of a 1970s, 1980s interior. I designed that desk for Joy in 1971, and it's got a bit of a different thing. It's got all
The filing behind.
the filing is in
Yeah.
there.
Craftsman's Market also had exhibitions.
I did quite a lot of furniture for Craftsman's
Yes.
Market. Simple things like tables. We got Milton Moon, who was a potter,
Yes.
a famous potter, to do tops for the tables. All that sort of thing. Couches, designed
Yes.
quite a lot of furniture. Yeah.
Yes.
And so we had a local industry going as well.
We have another colleague here we probably should have brought, Italian woman Sylvia Micheli, and she's interested in Scandinavian design and its
Yes.
influence in
Yes.
Italy and
I
Australia.
can talk
Because
to her
about the
about
same
that.
time that Hayes and Scott were working with a company called
Yes.
the Danish Furniture Company of Brisbane,
Yes, that's right.
building sort of knockoffs of
They
Danish furniture.
produced beautiful chairs. The Danish chairs they produced in black bean were exquisite. I'm sorry I haven't got any.
I've got a set of them.
You've got some. Aren't you lucky? Have you got the armchair?
The
You've
carver,
just-
yes. I've got a set of
Have you
6
got
with
the
2 carvers, yeah.
They are beautiful.
Yeah.
The curve. Oh, anyway, that's
So-
another story.
Well, I think it's an interesting story about design in Brisbane in general, because
Yeah.
Laurie West, who'd commissioned
Yes.
Carl Langer, ran
he
a
was
furniture
here
shop.
when we arrived.
Yeah.
And he had a shop, of course, that was designed by Carl Langer. And so
They were also doing modern furniture
that's right,
interiors.
yes, but he wasn't doing the sorts of things we were doing.
No.
I think he was encouraging local people. I don't think he had anything imported. He might have had
He
one
did
or two
say
pieces.
he was importing some stuff directly.
Maybe
yeah.
he got it up from Sydney.
I think he had some problem with his importer as well, or the person who was wholesaling it to him.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yes, I knew Laurie, and we spoke occasionally. And of course his daughter did architecture and did very well. Went to Harvard. She's still around, I think.
Margaret, yes, yes,
Yeah.
she is.
Okay, so
Back to the university then. So you started at the
Uh,
university. Who
yes.
was running the school then?
well, we had Professor Cummings. You may or may not remember Professor Cummings. He was there until
I
about
don't, but
I met him once at this at
Did you?
1986 when the
67, I
school was anniversary. Yeah. He was well and truly retired then.
66, 67,
Yeah.
he retired, and Gareth Roberts took over as head of architecture. I think he lasted about 2 years.
Mm.
While he was there, he did designs for the campus, which changed the whole thing.
this is Roberts.
This is Gareth Roberts.
Yeah.
Yes.
He asked me to help him with the planning,
Yes.
and he got rid of the circular drive, chopped it up, put buildings all over the place. I wasn't too happy with the way he put buildings in front of the great big building, but it happened. They needed the space, so that's what happened. Anyway, so Gareth then...
So Gareth Roberts
Gareth
cited the
Roberts.
later Gibson buildings.
He did the what?
The
Yes.
buildings you said were in front.
Yeah,
You meant
yeah.
the Gibson buildings,
That's
the
right.
library and the main
Yeah.
hall.
Yes. Then he took off for New South Wales and became Professor of Architecture, University of New South Wales. And then Balsani came in as our professor.
What year is that? I've forgotten.
We
I think it
about
was
73, I think it was.
73.
73.
Yes.
We had a year or so without a head, and Bill Gregg, I think, acted as head of architecture at the time. I think I'm right in that. In 1968, I completed my master's degree in housing, and I was doing a 3-year course in town planning at the same time, which I completed at 1968. So when the readership came up, I applied, and with those qualifications got the job. So it was a big jump from lecturer to reader. I don't like the idea of reader as a title, but
Sounds a little bit backward, doesn't it?
but there you go. And in 1970, I had my first sabbatical. So because of my interest in planning, I took off, first of all, for Japan. I went to Expo 70. Expo 70 was a very interesting thing. I landed in Tokyo, went to the University of Tokyo, got the professor to bring a student in, a master's student. He explained how Tokyo worked, and Tokyo is very different. And he said to the master's student, take Dr. De Gruchy, oh, I wasn't doctor then, take me to have a look at all the places I was interested in. What a day we had, travelling on the underground mainly. In Tokyo they have an area called gay places. A gay place has everything from chinko parlours, brothels. You can worship there, you could do whatever you want. The kids could have fun, they had games, gay places. A bit like South Bank could be, maybe, without the brothels. Anyway, so he then took me to a place called Shinjuku Junction. Shinjuku West is a very interesting station. They've redeveloped the whole damn thing into a number of levels, and an old gasworks has been taken over with a series of 30, 40-storey point block offices. For me, that was a very interesting experience. And we ended the day in the Ginza at a bar. I said to the student, I can't afford a bar, I know they're expensive. He said, I'll talk to the manager. So we sat down with a hostess, a lovely hostess, and I got out a piece of paper and I said, through the student, could you draw a picture of your home? And this opened up a whole conversation about the way they lived. You know, the tatami mat thing, tokonomas. I became very interested in Japan at that time. Anyway, I went to Expo, which took the bullet train down to Kyoto, spent one night in Kyoto up on the mountains in one of those ryokan type inns. They gave me a lovely European room with a bed and a dressing gown with all writing on it and all the nice things. In the morning, I opened the sojis and the landscape was white. All the fir trees had snow on them. Absolute magic. You wouldn't believe it. Anyway, it was much too far from Expo 70, so reluctantly I went back to Kyoto, and then on to, I think it was about 8 kilometres south of Kyoto was the Expo ground. What I was interested there in was moving footpaths. Instead of having what we had in Expo 88, which was a monorail, they had a series of moving footpaths in tubes. So the only problem was between the tubes. If they had too many people coming off a footpath and too many people coming up escalators to the platform, there was a bit of a problem. But basically it took people right through the whole expo. Very interesting. So I thought that would be really good for Brisbane somewhere. I'm not sure where, but somewhere. Anyway, I then took the second flight, I think, to Honolulu on a 747. Now that was a jumbo. I was a bit worried. There was hardly any people in the plane. I had 4 or 5 seats. Absolutely wonderful, but it was a beautiful flight. Had a look at Honolulu, went on to San Francisco, went to all the different places like the main university out at
Berkeley?
Berkeley campus, went to their architecture department, etc., etc. And then I just continued that tour all the way through America. Went down to Mexico City as a thing, up to Atlanta City to talk to John Portman.
Oh, you met Portman.
Oh yeah, interesting guy. And the first time I walked in, I was staying at his hotel. I walked into the entrance, which was a fairly low ceiling, and suddenly the atrium struck me. You've got to do this sometime. This is an incredible feeling. Walking into a building with an atrium 50 stories or 40 stories or whatever it was. That became his thing. After that he put John Portman things up all over the place. But after Atlanta I went on up to Philadelphia, New York, wherever I was able to get information about all sorts of things. I met in San Francisco, I met the Skidmore, Owings and Merrill people. They took me through their office, took me to dinner at night. Absolutely wonderful. You know, San Francisco is a fantastic city. Have you been to San Francisco?
Yes,
Yeah.
Lovely.
I won't go any further. It's a terrific place.
I wonder, Graham, if I could take you back to your first impressions about the architecture scene in Brisbane when you were at State Works and when you first joined UQ. And particularly, I guess we're interested in the older generation, people like Cummings and Lucas and
I
what sort of people were they?
had a rapport with the students. They were interested in everything from Buckminster Fuller, which I introduced to them. I'd spent 4 days with Bucky. He was lecturing about what he called his energetic geometry.
Is that when he visit to Australia, or had you met him elsewhere?
No, I met him in South Africa. He lectured at the University of the Witwatersrand. 4 days. He just, we stopped all our lectures. He just lectured 3 or 4 hours at a time. An incredible person. Anyway, he introduced me to the idea of synergy. Synergy, he said, was when you add 1 plus 2 and it makes 4. So we said, oh, that's lovely. So he said, well, I'll show you how it works. And he put his pyramid, his 3-sided pyramid, and he said, underneath is your 4th side. Anyway, that was just the beginning of what he was talking about. He taught me how to put dowel sticks together with nylon line and make these tensegrity structures. We've got a bridge of one now, much years thereon, but the same idea. So I showed the students how to do this, how to make a geodesic, and later on at the university in the great campus, I think we'd actually put up a geodesic structure. 1966 or 67.
There was a proprietary one that I think that you bought under the stairs at the department for a long time, with a clipped together node system of pressed metal. Did you you acquired that, or?
Well, I was behind the students. I'm not sure who'd actually put up the geodesic, but that was just one of the structures that we were busy with.
Was that kind of thinking seen as sort of a bit revolutionary compared to the curriculum that Cummings had put in place? Or?
Oh, I think so. I think poor old Cummings was of the old school, and I don't really, I think he was a nice man and interested in modern architecture, but I don't think he was really well advanced in technology or any of those things. So I think that's about enough said of...
and Bruce Lucas, was he?
Bruce was the lecturer in construction, I think, mainly. He was there for about 3 years before he retired. I think they retired more or less the same time.
Yeah, they did. They retired the same year.
Because I took Bruce's position, I think, as a reader, and they made Stan Marcus Kyle a reader at the same time because they felt they could have two readers.
And Langer, was he teaching at the time?
Who was that?
Carl Langer.
Carl Langer, occasionally. I got on quite well with Carl. He invited me to dinner and showed me all sorts of things that were going on. I believe he lectured on solar design in the late 50s and I think a little bit in the early 60s. But he only gave 1 or 2 lectures while I was there.
He and Bob Cummings were both interested in Japan. They used to go there regularly. Was there a wider interest in Japan in the school at the time?
There was a fairly wide interest. One of the things that we found most interesting was in New Farm there was a Japanese house. This would have been 1964, 65. The Japanese house was pretty damn good. It must have been transported and erected. I had a good look through it. I thought, this is wonderful. And the next thing, it was demolished.
It was partly salvaged and moved to North Queensland.
Is that where they took it?
Yes, it's partly reassembled in
thank
Tully
goodness for that.
I think it's
That's
actually
something I didn't know.
Yes.
I wondered what happened.
It was quite well documented at the time when
they transferred it.
Belonged to a judge, somebody or other who.
So it's up there, is it?
A bit, yeah, the guts of it, but I think a lot of the decorative tiles and timber work and so on were lost or picked or souvenired by people in people's homes.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. It's a very interesting story. Yeah.
So, I think Japan is naturally a very interesting place. Their modern architecture too. I mean, when you look at the one that we've got as an example on the corner of Creek and Queen Street, that 45 stories with a swivelling...
Yeah, Kurokawa, yeah.
Very interesting building. I know Peddlethorpe and Harvey were involved with it, but it was the Japanese architect who did the job.
So who were when you were working with works and beginning at the school, who did you think were the more progressive architects in the city? Who were doing the more interesting things that you thought were showing the way forward?
Well, while I was with the works department, every day I would come in by tram or bus, depending on what was happening at home, and walk through all the arcades in the city centre and around all the blocks. I got to know the city centre really well. If you walk through an urban area consistently, you really get to know what's going on, I think. Anyway, that eventually became the subject of my PhD. That was so useful. But while I was there, I met a few architects. The first architects I met outside of the works department was Morris Hurst and John Morton. They were working for Lund Hutton Newell. Lund Hutton Newell had quite a progressive practice, widespread. They were doing work in the country and all over the place.
And they did that nice slab block in New Farm, Glenfalloch, which would be about 59 or something about there.
They did a block?
A big slab block of housing in New Farm called Glenfalloch.
I'm just trying to think of it.
It's one of the nicer, modernist blocks. It would be about 1959.
Do you know the street?
It's on Oxlade Drive, just where the ferry stops now.
Yes. I think
Morris Hurst might
Morris
have been
was
the
involved.
designer of that, yeah.
12 stories or so. Very, very good building.
Very elegant.
Yeah. Morris was interested in rustic architecture, really, brutal, using rough materials, natural timbers, etc., etc. And a lot of his stuff was really good. Got on very well with Morris for years and years. Pity he died. He moved up to Noosa, and I think he enjoyed living up there, so we just didn't see much of each other. But nice guy. John Morton I didn't see too much of. He stayed with the practice here, I think, and then he started his own practice, I think. Neville Lunt was wonderful. He took me to places, introduced me to Dodd's work in the country down
Tamrukum, and
south of Brisbane, and
beautiful chapel at Tamrukum.
there
you
were
could see
2 or 3 big old houses,
Oh,
etc.,
yes,
that he was in.
remember the name of it?
Some quite well-known families, the Bells.
The bells are at Cooch, I think.
Cooch, yep.
That's
I remember doing sketches of the gateposts and lovely architecture. Okay, so
What
Morris,
about-
but unfortunately Neville died. He died, I think, when he was only about 50, maybe 55.
What
Very
did you
young.
make of other practices like Hayes and Scott and Birrell and Dalton?
I met people in almost all of the practices. I got on particularly well with some of them and not so well with some of them. You know, architects who are very creative tend to have egos like elephants. I mean, it goes with the field, I think. And so some are very prickly and others are very talky. Ian Charlton with I think it was a big firm that he worked with, Conrad and Gargott.
Yeah.
Ian Charlton, we got on extremely well, and I think he worked with Sir Penn.
Yes.
Her surname is difficult. Sir Penn did the law building in the city and changed the top. Do you remember that one? And she did a reuse. I think she did the government house, old government house upgrade, and something next to St. Stephen's Cathedral. I think there's a building next to that. I think she did all those things. So Sir Penn, she used to go into Craftsman's Market quite often, and so did Tom Heath. Tom Heath, at the time, I think, was head of
QIT.
QIT. Another nice guy. I didn't know him too well, but well enough. Who else? Hayes and Scott. I met Hayes and Scott. Eddie Hayes was very personable. We used to dance quite frequently at his parties. I think he liked joy. You know, this happened. Whether anything happened or not, I've no idea, but there were quite a few ladies there that I liked too, so we had a lovely time. He had a house on Brisbane Drive, I think, you know where the golf course is?
Yeah.
Below the uni.
Yeah, Long Pocket. Yeah. There's a house, their own house looked on a bend of the river a little bit like this.
Yes, I think I'm not sure whether the house is still there, but I think so.
Sure.
But I don't think Eddie survived. I think he's
gone.
Is he alive?
No. They're both gone.
Okay, so Scott was more prickly. I talked to him, but you know, he wasn't too communicative. But he did good things. I mean, his houses were very good. I used to play bridge in a house in Blackburn Street, I think, in Toowong West. Jacoby, I think was the name. Joan Jacoby.
Yeah.
We used to play bridge there quite frequently, so I got to know the house well, you know, very good design. What else?
Well,
You know,
John Dalton?
John Dalton. Very difficult time with John Dalton. We had a relationship on and off. He wanted to report me for doing something I said, go ahead and report me. I can't remember what it was, but you know, that sort of a prickly thing, and then he'd turn around and pat my back or whatever. Anyway, I liked his architecture. His house for the Wilsons in Mount Coot-tha was another house I played bridge at frequently, and the parties there were interesting. They had people in the party, in a social group, like the Coordinator General, trying to think of his name.
Was it Max Schubert's day? Or
Say that again?
Max Schubert, not his day? Would have been a little bit earlier than that. He went on to become
It
Coordinator
would have
General.
been a bit earlier than Sherman. Yeah,
Schumann.
Sherman, I think he. Sherbert. Another one that comes to mind is married to the Governor General.
Oh, Michael Bryce. Yeah.
Michael Bryce, yes.
Yes. He was a student at the university then? Or?
He was just
finished.
before I was
Yeah.
a lecturer. I think he just completed. And he had a small practice, did a house for his mother, I think, in St. Lucia. Quite a nice house.
Michael's someone we should interview as well, actually. He's
Okay. It's just off the main road, but it's a nice house. And then he went into his own practice with symbols. He was...
Graphics.
He's
yeah.
went from
Graphic
architecture into
designer.
graphics, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
There were a lot of people around Theo Thine's office at the time. Robin Gibson was there about the time Dalton was, and then Gibson would have been practicing.
Gibson comes into it, and I'll come back to him for a minute. When I took over the final year architecture, would have been late 60s, I think. Price was lecturing, not, what's her name? Not Bronwyn,
Give me a clue.
what's her first name? Bryce.
Oh, Quinton.
Quinton was lecturing law.
She was lecturing
Yes.
in architecture. I got her to come in and do contracts.
Okay.
All right.
Well, either I had to do it or I could get a lawyer, and she was available, so that was my connection there. I think we had another lecturer as well. I'm not too sure. She's now a judge
Oh, okay.
who did some of the work for that final year. 2 or 3 years, I think she did the work.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting connection. Now, getting back to Gibson, I met him, I think, about 64, 65. He was doing really good work, and I did an article for Art and Australia in which I think I put 1 or 2 of his buildings.
Yes.
Have you come across that article?
I have actually.
There
It's
should
about
be a copy in
1978.
those files, which I'll
Yes.
give you.
Mm.
They just wrote and asked me if I'd do an article on what was currently interesting in Brisbane, and Gibson was one of the 5 or 6 or 7 architects, I think.
You also did a review of an exhibition, I remember,
A review
of an exhibition that was held at the Johnston Gallery in '68.
I might have done that. It might have been in conjunction with that.
I think it was.
The
yes.
Johnston Gallery became very important in the 60s.
Yes.
For us, anyway, it was a wonderful place to go, maybe once a month, when a new exhibition was put on. Wine was served, lovely people, people that we found lovely, interesting, from all different fields.
Do you know Nancy Underhill's doing a study of the Johnston Gallery? It's going to be an exhibition at State Library next year, I think, with a bit of a little history of the Johnston Gallery and the people who were there and so on. I'm sure you'd be interested in.
Yeah, we bought a few things. We bought a Shillam bull. Shillams did a beautiful big bull with lovely horns, and I put that in the courtyard of that first house of mine. And my daughter took it to, I think, Canberra. Yeah, she lives in Canberra. She took it to Canberra, and I think the rust got too bad, so it's all rusted away. But it was a beautiful, strong bull. Oh, Shillam did some good work, because he did the pelicans and things, I think, in Gibson's art gallery.
Yes.
Okay, now I liked Gibson's work.
Yes.
The simplicity really appealed to me. He was a modern architect, very dedicated, did some lovely sketches of things. You'll find in the file some of his sketches of the art gallery that he did, sitting, just talking about his work, which I think you'll be particularly interested in. You're doing something on Dalton, though, aren't you?
Yeah, but Dalton was actually involved in...
But they were all involved at that time.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there was an exhibition at QUT. A lady by the name of, and I'll think of it in a minute.
Peter Dennis? Was that the...
Yes.
Peter Dennis exhibition?
Peter Dennis
Yes.
actually put up an exhibition of work of
That,
60s architects.
that's right.
So you've
60s
got that
cool.
copy, I think,
Yes.
probably.
Yes.
All right.
You were very involved also when you first arrived in Brisbane in the Contemporary Art Society.
Yes, I did quite a lot of painting.
And you did paintings and
Oh, I did.
you exhibited your
And
work.
I exhibited in those days, but then it just became hobby art,
Right,
just hobbies.
yes.
And I've never sold very much because I just haven't had an exhibition.
Yeah.
But I've done a lot of work.
Many architects involved in the Contemporary Art Society?
Were the architects involved
Yes.
in
The Contemporary Art Society.
a few? I'm trying to think of names. They were mainly very wild artists like Roy Churcher and the famous artist, what was his name?
John Mulvig.
Mulvig.
Yeah.
They were always into dispute. I don't know why they ended up fighting or something. And
As Haig Beck was telling me the other day that he thought that Roy and Betty Churcher were some of the more influential people in the architecture scene at the time.
they, in a way, yes. Well, Betty was particularly interested. And I liked Roy's painting. I mean, he's beautiful, vigorous, lovely paintings. Have you seen any of Roy's paintings?
I have one on my wall.
Have you?
Yes.
I'll tell you who's got another good one is the photographer who's an architect.
Dick Stringer.
Richard Stringer.
Richard.
Yes.
He's
We were
got
there
he's
yesterday, weren't we? Or the day before.
He's got a lovely collection of paintings.
Yeah.
He's been collecting for years, and his church is pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else can I tell you?
Your style of art, because I've seen some of your early paintings, and it's changed. So you were doing quite abstract things.
Oh, I loved abstract, and I
Yes.
still do abstract work,
Yes.
but it's more difficult.
Yes.
So occasionally I do something which is fairly literal,
Yes.
simply because I was able to do it, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know, when you've been to a place and admired it, I've been to visit maybe 8 or 10 times, so I wanted to have a picture of it. I've done another big one down below. We'll go down there later.
Okay.
I was interested when you're talking about Morris Hurst and interested in like
Yes.
very heavy
Yeah.
and brutal kind of style. And that's I guess there was, Birrell's seems to be popular with some of the younger students because he was taking up some of the brutalist attitudes that were coming out of Britain through the AR,
Yes, Jim
but also
Birrell
in Sydney at the time.
did a lot of experimental buildings, you know, starting with his swimming pools in Gregory Terrace, the library here in Toowong, you know, the one with the... And he did some good buildings at the university, obviously. He had good students working with him. And I think I got on the wrong side of Jim Birrell for criticising his fireplace in the Union building. You know, it's
Union College, the big arches.
a rather wild fireplace. with the rest of the building is very elegant, enormously elegant.
Mm.
Anyway, I think I rubbed him up the wrong way, and he doesn't like me.
Was there a contrast in thinking at the time between interest in sort of brutalist architecture and the nuts and berries things that were coming out of Sydney, and the more fuller high tech, lightweight,
John,
more technical?
the influences. I mean, Sydney was so pervasive. You know, it had people working there who were working very cleverly with heavy structures. I mean, this is apart from Seidler. I'm just trying to think of the name of the guy who did those nice timber construction works in different levels. I'll think of his name in a minute. There were 2 or 3 really top architects that influenced a lot of us, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But the influences came not only from Sydney and Melbourne, but from all the different magazines, you know, all those architecture magazines. My God.
There seems to be a bit of a split between those people who read AR and those people who read AD. Which one did you read?
Well, I was in both.
Yeah.
And not only both, but in all the other continental ones.
Yeah.
You know, there was Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, that's the French one.
Mm.
Domus. Domus was fabulous. I really enjoyed Domus because it had a big range of architecture and interior fittings and all furniture. Oh, it's hard to say.
Well, while we're on Domus, one of the things we're interested in particular is
Yeah.
the conferences of 1967,
Yeah.
because Giaponti came, the students invited him for the conference of that year. I think you were involved in that conference. So we're kind of interested because the national conference is on in Brisbane, and the students set up what seems to be, on paper at least, a more interesting conference.
Are we talking about the one in Toowoomba?
Oh, no,
I gave a lecture
Brisbane we're talking about.
in Toowoomba. I can't remember the one in Brisbane.
It was Giaponti was there, Tony Gwilliam came out, Harry
The one in
Seidler.
Toowoomba was all about computers.
No.
I think that was a later one.
Was-
Yeah.
Almost no one had any idea of what a computer was all about. And I was trying to tell them that they had to come to grips with a computer or they were going to be in the backwoods very soon. So I think I got that message across, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think we saw your name on the program as someone who judged a student competition
Oh,
as
yeah.
part of that.
Don
That
Watson
might
won that
well have been.
competition.
Don Watson won it.
He told me yesterday.
I didn't know. So it just seems very interesting because there was this, there's the national conference about which we don't know very much so much,
Yeah.
but the students ran this student conference and it was 67, it was the
Yeah.
Astor Theatre
Yeah.
in New Farm, and they'd invited Giaponti out, editor of Domus
Oh,
at the
yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and he spent like a week in Brisbane, I think, and also Tony Gwilliam was the
that's
other
right.
sort of person who had big influence, and he later taught at the school for...
I wasn't there. I must have been on leave somewhere,
Ah.
sabbatical, because I didn't meet him. I'm sorry, because he would have been really interesting to talk to. You'll have to find someone who was in Brisbane. From 1970, every 3 years I went overseas for 6 months, which was fabulous. But of course, I missed out on quite a lot of what was going on. Okay, so where have we got up to?
Where have we got up to?
Where are we at, as they
Where
say?
are we at?
We're
Well, so-
talking about
Well,
the
I hope you're
magazines
going to
before.
edit this.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Mm.
The 1970s were fantastic for me.
Yes.
Yeah.
I started thinking about underground architecture. What everyone was missing was that we were building deeper and deeper into the earth without actually recording where this was happening, especially in the city centre. The new public parking under King George Square was down 6 floors or 5 floors. People were starting to excavate 3 and 4 floors all over the place for big buildings. And I thought, I've got to do something about this. So I did a PhD on underground architecture or 3-dimensional architecture, By the time I'd completed it, other people had been working in the same field. They wouldn't accept my thesis. They said, you have to have something uniquely, unassailably yours. So I had to go right back and start a new thesis. So that's when I did the PhD on the city centre, because I thought, bugger it, nobody knows the city centre like I know it.
Right.
So that was the beginning of that. So at the end of 3 years I completed that, and it was a success, no
Yes.
trouble. All the examiners were very happy with it.
Yeah. Who supervised your thesis? Because
Did I?
who supervised the thesis?
Somebody at Technion
Yes.
in Israel,
Yes.
one person in Sydney, could have been Gareth Roberts, I'm not sure.
These were the examiners, were they?
Yes, and I think Lewis Keeble,
Okay.
because it had a lot of planning in it.
Mm.
Yes.
Yes.
And who supervised it at the university?
Theoretically, it was Balsani,
Yes.
but of course he didn't know much about
Brisbane.
architecture at that point. He was
Yes.
into pig poo, I think it was. Yeah,
What?
developing energy with
Yes.
pig poo. Oh, more than that, he was into, I think, very primitive structures on the islands or something.
Yes,
wasn't it?
yes.
Yeah.
Tropical architecture.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
with the UN, yeah.
Vernacular architecture, I think they called it.
Mm.
Talking about vernacular architecture, in 1955, Neutra came out to visit us in Johannesburg,
Mm.
and he asked me to show him a few things, and I took him to something he wanted to see,
Mm.
which was the African tribe that did all those colourful walls and house
Mm.
colours, thatched roofs.
Yes.
They painted beautiful colours. So I took him up there and he took a lot of photographs. He wasn't interested in architecture in Johannesburg
Yes.
because he had architecture in California, so Johannesburg was nothing. But he was very interested in the Mapoch, I think they were called. It's an African tribe, MPOG.
So what do you think were the big issues in architecture and architectural education in the 70s? That's
In
the
the
period
70s.
That's the period when energy became a big issue in architectural science.
Well, I think what happened was there was a carry-on from the concept of solar architecture for a while. Then I think architects got a bit bored with solar architecture and modern architecture. And then air conditioning became fairly easy and available. So why worry about being solar if you can air condition something? So the concept of design began to change towards more complex designs.
Mm.
In the late 70s you could just see this beginning, and certainly through the 80s. Then everything split up. There was high tech in the early 80s. We had the present, I'm trying to think of his name. It'll come in a minute. He works with BVN.
Oh, Chris
John
Clark.
Chris Clark. He did his first house, I think, it's in my first book anyway.
Mm.
And his contemporary is also there. He's in the Institute. I think he's
Not Shane.
Shane Thompson.
Shane Thompson. They were the two high-tech people that I can remember.
Mm.
Then there were the people who did very big houses using Palladian concepts.
Mm.
There was one particular one on the river, and I'll think of the name of the architect. Kratzmann built his house up in St.
Oh, yes,
Lucia
yeah.
Heights.
Mm.
That was a pure Palladian villa.
Mm.
And outside of Brisbane, in the big blocks, beyond Kenmore, there are quite a lot of Palladian villas. So there was this movement. Then there was the ranch style. The ranch style started to pervade all the big blocks where you could put wings out, etc., etc. So there were a whole lot of movements going on.
Mm.
For me, I visited the Alhambra in 1977, and the Alhambra, if you've ever been to Spain, to south of Spain, is an absolutely beautiful palace. Rugged, hard, but so romantic. And I thought, modern architecture is really a little deprived, you know. It's a little bit like bringing kids up in a house with no books or paintings. A little bit sparse. I'm still a modern architect up to a point, but I'm also a romantic. So I've got a split personality, I suppose.
So these first ideas of like return of historicism were about in the 70s when you're talking about the Palladian style mansions and so on.
Yes.
I know you yourself are interested in the longer history of Brisbane architecture and 19th century building and so on.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how people what it was like in the 70s, I guess, as people start to recover an idea of 19th century Brisbane and the traditional house forms, and was that important at the university at the time?
Well, it's hard to answer that, but those two files were the support files for my first volume on architecture, which really starts from the beginning up to Expo. So I'll leave those with you so you can look at those. Where the actual change took place, or how it took place, depended on the architects themselves. I think there were always a group that wanted to do a certain type of house, but there were others, and quite a few others, who weren't at all worried about style. They would just go along with the client. If the client wanted a certain thing, you know, this happens, doesn't it? Then you get a couple of people like Donovan Hills, who have a very, very definite idea of what they want to do. You know, very complex, but based around their courtyard concepts. But they only come in really in the 90s. But they were those sorts of people who had very special ideas about architecture.
I was wondering about, like, say, roof forms and John Dalton's work, or you talked about the Jacoby House earlier.
Yes.
I mean, at the time, were those buildings seen as an attempt to reconcile modern architecture with traditional forms? Is that how you would have thought about it?
Well, I think up to a point, Hayes and Scott, with their roof forms, attempted this. I think John Dalton, with his mono pictures, did the same thing. I think his very early houses were very flat skillions. But over the period of the 60s, they definitely went for the pictures, whether as a pyramid or whether as a series of mono pictures. Yes, you're right there. Clear stories, etc. Yeah. So there was that group that worked that way.
I know you were also interested in social science aspects of architecture, and you taught me about defensible space and ideas about self-securing spaces and so on. So did social science aspects of architecture start to play a bigger role in the school at that time?
Well, I think social science is a pretty wide thing. You really have to narrow it down a little bit when it comes to architecture. Firstly, there's the concept of scale. You know, domestic human scale is all about something that's fairly small, whereas political architecture is gigantic. I mean, the Romans, I suppose, and the Greeks before them, and maybe even the Egyptians before them, discovered the concept of magnitude, you know, huge columns, gigantic spaces, wherever this could be possible. So you have a very big schism between the social concept of space and the political concept of space. well, there are lots of people, wide corridors, small houses, narrow corridors. There's a whole series of things that goes on in terms of, this may not be answering what you have in mind, but is that what you're interested in?
When did that start to be an issue? When did an awareness of that start to?
When I was about 18, I suppose.
Okay.
Johannesburg had a connection with Le Corbusier.
Okay.
The school converted to a Corb school about 1938, I suppose.
Okay.
Dr. Martinson wrote about the idea of space in classical architecture, but he also wrote about Corb's work.
Okay.
Corb was very influential in the big houses in Joburg. He did all those lovely white houses on pillars and, you know, framed windows, etc. So when they were being constructed, I would ride around on my bike and get off and walk in and have a look. And the idea of double volumes and mezzanines all came across as something really interesting. Staircases were a particularly interesting thing. It seems to me that architects don't pay enough attention to staircases. The simple straight staircase is really not a good idea. I hope it doesn't offend all of you. It's much better to have staircases that have a landing, and also the relationship of the treads to the risers, as you know, is very important. You know, if you're going quickly, you need big treads and small risers, and if you're going up steeply, you need the reverse. So staircases, strange staircases, wonderful they became very important in my thinking. Not that I've had an opportunity to do it, but I'll tell you who was good at that was Harry Seidler. His building down in Sydney, you know, where they have their practice, on, is it, on the other side of Sydney, McMahon's Point. He's got a wonderful staircase, semicircular staircase.
Graham, you did do some building in Brisbane. Always admired your flats in Toowong. Could you tell us a little bit about the buildings that you did do?
Well, I did. The first thing was the fixing up of 79 Birdwood Terrace, and I've got pictures of that. Then I did a couple of competitions, those housing competitions in the 67, I think, and 69. Cluster houses, I think, was the one I got a second prize in. I think the first prize went to O'Gorman and Carr. I think they worked together. I got a second prize, I think, in the second competition on housing. That was for the 70s. That was that, what's the name house? I'm just trying to think who won the first prize. I think he's got a practice in Toowong.
Don't know.
Anyway, I'll think of it in a minute.
Denham and Munro.
No, I think it is HAUP maybe. There's a practice in Toowong,
Yes.
in Sylvan Road.
Yes.
I'm just trying to think of the partners. Anyway, he won the first prize with a vertical thing with things coming off of it. Okay, so then I did the gallery for Craftsman's Market. I did an office block for P&O in the drive that goes out along on the way to the airport. What's the name of
Kingsford
that?
Smith Drive? Kingsford Smith? Or?
Yeah, Kingsford Smith Drive. P&O wanted a small office building, so I designed a fairly small one-storey high with a central chamber that sucked all the air in, and etc., etc. But I think it's been demolished.
Where was it? It was
About
halfway
where
up?
the P&O properties were.
Okay.
An engineer by the name of John Rowe was the engineer to P&O, and he hired me to do the job. Then there was the new gallery for Craftsman's Market when we bought the house on the corner of Jefferson Street. I added a totally new section with a slightly pitched roof, about 40 by 20, I think it was. There was quite a big gallery on the site. Do you remember the gallery at all?
I do. And it had a wonderful deck in the middle.
I put a new entrance lobby between the old house and a new gallery, and I linked it through to the shop.
Yes.
With decks.
Yes. I remember the decks. I
That
remember
was the
going.
one. Okay. Then I altered a house in Carmody Road that Gibson then altered when I sold, and it's subsequently been altered again into a huge house. I think it's 50 Carmody Road, 4950 Carmody Road. Then I bought a house in Swan Road, 340 Swan Road, and after I sold, I fixed that up, did a renovation there, and when I sold that, I think an architect who operates from New Farm, quite well known. He's got his office in that complex where the coffee shop and the...
Oh, you're not thinking of Geoffrey Pye, who was there for many years.
Geoffrey Pye.
Yeah.
He took over and for, I think, a couple of orthodontists bought the house, and he added a wing to it and did a couple of alterations. So that was the Carmody Road. But after that, I was really just into competitions and writing theses and books and things.
And teaching.
Teaching,
Good.
which I really enjoyed.
And raising
But I
four.
used to put people to sleep, I think. There was always a student in the front of the class who would go to sleep. I'm trying to think of her name. Was it Susan, maybe?
Who went to sleep? Wasn't me.
I think there are a lot of
Susan
people who were
Savage.
big...
Oh, she
Sue
went to
Savage.
sleep.
Oh, I think it might have been Susan.
She's now a professor at QUT.
But there were a couple of them anyway.
I think people didn't just party a lot, Graham. I think you can blame yourself. I think they've been up late.
You know, when you're lecturing, you look at the audience every now and then and you think,
What are they thinking?
yeah.
Oh, just what are they thinking?
Anyway, something interesting happened in 1965, I think. We were still in the old building, you know, that's the tower. We had a lecture room in the tower with long benches. Don Simpson, I think, was the guy who erected all this, designed by the professor. And I was lecturing in interior design, and I found the bad guys were always sitting at the back. There were some bad guys in those days. I won't mention names, but I'll tell you, they weren't hooligans, but they were hard on the lecturer. So I thought I'll try an experiment, and I'd painted different colours on all the benches that they were sitting at. I put purple at the back, and then black, I think, and then dark blue, and I came up to light colours at the front. And I wondered how this would go. Well, the reaction came one night. They came in with bottles of beer, and they put paint all over the place, and they sprinkled the place. I tell you, it was a disaster. I had to apologise to the Zillman Cowan was the Vice-Chancellor. I was really contrite about the whole thing because, you know, this maybe shouldn't have happened because I did an experiment. Anyway, they were pretty good kids. They got into it, cleaned it all up, repainted the walls.
Yes.
In a week it was back to normal, but without all the colours. So that's just a little story which maybe nobody else has, I don't know.
No, we don't have that one.
Now, John Simpson and Ian Cinnamon didn't get on too well.
No.
I don't know why. There was antipathy. And I had to get them both up to my room when I was dean and tell them that this is just not good enough, you know. But they settled down eventually. But I don't know why there was an antipathy.
This is
Antipathy.
Don Simpson.
Don Simpson was
Yes.
the
Yes.
person in the workshop,
Yes.
and he'd been there for yonks.
Yes.
And then Ray Hollywood took over,
Yeah.
and he was very good too. I got on well with Ray.
Mm.
He made a lovely model of my plastic house, which I've got downstairs, and I want you to take back, if you wouldn't mind, to the department.
Mm-hmm.
It really belongs to the department. But I was hoping to go on with that experiment and maybe develop something from it. Anyway, so there was John Simpson and Ray Hollywood, and I don't know who your workshop man is now, but he's got lovely machinery. I looked at it when I was over there. You've got a lovely place to work in.
Yes.
A little bit
I was
full
so
of people,
impressed.
unfortunately.
Oh,
Yeah.
boy.
Yeah.
And your use of computers too, you know, with all of this going on. I mean, the kids can put up through CAD, you know, wonderful things, can't they?
Okay.
So what other things were you interested in?
You were dean for a while.
Yes,
You were dean.
yes. I was sub-dean in the early, just before the 80s, and then
Yes.
dean in the early 80s for
Yes.
2 years or so,
Yes.
which I didn't mind, but I didn't like.
No.
It meant sitting at those meetings for hours in the academic boardroom, listening to people talking about things that were of absolutely no interest, and arguments going on. Goodness knows, I just wanted to get back to design and research and things. So during the late 70s, I did a funny thing on criminology. There was money going, and Balsani said to me, "Wouldn't you like to take up some of these funds?" So I said, "Well, what sort of money are we talking about?" I think it was $500, not very much. So we did Crime and Architecture, which you've probably got a copy of in the library.
Well, that's what I was remembering before when I was saying that you taught me some social science aspects of architecture. I think I must have been in my second or third year when we were involved in that project. Yeah.
How that happened was this. Joy had a burglary at Craftsman's Market. Somebody snuck in the side or one of the back windows, took all the beautiful jewellery from one of the cases, mainly silver, designed by somebody, and we were so cross. And then a few months or years later, somebody lit something under the back door, and the whole place went up in flames. When they got there very quickly because the fire brigade wasn't far away, but with all the fire brigade hoses, it ruined fabrics and so that was another little bit of a disaster. So I thought, if I do crime and architecture, I'm going to do burglary, vandalism, and arson. Well, when I went to go and see the police about arson, they said, "Forget it, Sonny, forget it. It's a big, complicated thing. It's got the insurance companies, it's too big." So we settled on burglary and vandalism in 4 different sub-centres in Brisbane, which is all in the book anyway. And we did an analysis of which properties were most vulnerable, which had been burgled, which had been vandalised, and it became fairly apparent that anything that stuck out was vandalised, so that was a pretty easy one. And for burglaries, it was mainly the back windows which were not defended. So we came up with some propositions there. Anyway, so that was crime and architecture. They wanted me to go on and do another one, so I said, Gary Hansford can do it, I'm out. So Gary did the next one. I don't know what he did, but he did another one.
We should perhaps think about packing up and looking through the files that you'd like to show us.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Sure. Unless there are more
Well,
questions.
just
No.
very quickly,
Yes.
if I can open this up.
I was going to say though, it was very sad. The Craftsman's Market house has only recently disappeared.
Oh, sorry?
The Craftsman's Market has only recently disappeared. Like the house has been there, it was there for a long time in Toowong with all its
Yeah.
beautiful trees.
About 2 years ago they demolished it.
Yeah, very sad.
Yeah, we were sad.